The forest was still that morning, the kind of silence that made every heartbeat sound like thunder. It was the hour when the world felt half asleep, wrapped in the pale glow of dawn, and the breath of the earth came in slow, steady sighs. Frost clung to every pine needle, each one glittering like glass beneath the first rays of light. The ground crunched under heavy boots as Jack McGraw, the largest man in 3 counties, made his way through the clearing. His flannel shirt was streaked with sawdust, and his broad shoulders moved like boulders rolling through the mist. He wasn't a man people talked to much. Most of the small-town folk only saw him from afar, driving his old pickup down the logging roads, or at the diner where he sat in the corner drinking black coffee without saying a word. He wasn't unfriendly, just a man who had built walls around himself. Years ago, he used to laugh, used to sing songs while he worked. But after the accident that took his younger brother, those songs died in his throat. Every swing of his axe since then had been quieter, heavier. The rhythm of the forest had become a penance. The trees listened, the mountains watched, and Jack worked in silence. That morning, the air was colder than usual. His breath came out in pale clouds as he set his axe down and took off his gloves to rub his hands. He'd been assigned this patch of land just the day before, new territory farther north than he'd ever gone. The company wanted these pines cleared by the week's end. Prime timber, they'd said. Clean cuts, big pay. He didn't care much for the pay anymore. He just worked because work kept his mind from drifting back to that one night, the night when the storm had hit, the wind howling through the trees, his brother's voice shouting something he never quite heard, and then the sound of splintering wood. He shook the memory off, picked up his axe, and approached the largest tree in the clearing, a towering pine that must have stood for centuries. Its trunk was wide enough for 3 men to wrap their arms around it, its bark dark and rough like old leather. Moss grew in the cracks, and something about it felt ancient, sacred even. Jack paused for a moment, his instincts whispering that maybe this tree wasn't meant to fall. But orders were orders. He swung his axe, the blade biting deep into the wood. The sharp crack echoed through the forest, scattering a flock of crows from the nearby branches. He raised the axe again for another strike. "Please, mister, don't cut that tree." The sound was so soft he thought he imagined it. He froze mid-swing, his breath catching in his throat. He turned his head slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. Only mist and morning light. He frowned, lowering the axe, then he heard it again, this time closer. "Please don't hurt her." Jack turned fully, his boots creaking in the frost. And there, standing just a few feet away, were 2 small figures. They couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, a boy and a girl, both barefoot, both dressed in simple handmade clothes of tan hide and cloth. Their dark hair glistened in the morning light, long and tangled, and their faces bore faint markings of white and red, painted in delicate lines across their cheeks and foreheads. The boy's expression was fierce despite his trembling chin. The girl clutched a small wooden charm carved in the shape of a bird. Jack blinked, completely thrown off. He hadn't seen anyone out here for days. This part of the forest was miles from the nearest road. "What are you 2 doing out here?" he asked, voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. The boy stepped forward, his tiny hands balled into fists. "You can't cut that tree. It's our mother's." Jack stared confused. "Your mother's?" The girl nodded slowly, eyes filling with tears. "She's inside it. Her spirit lives there. You'll hurt her if you cut it down." Jack felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. He looked back at the tree, then at the children. Their eyes, dark, steady, and far older than their years, watched him like the forest itself was watching through them. "Listen, kids," he said, setting the axe against his shoulder. "I don't mean any harm, but I got a job to do. This area's marked for logging. If I don't cut it, someone else will." The boy shook his head fiercely. "No one should. Not this one." He stepped closer, placing his small hand on the trunk. "This tree is where our mother rests. The tribe buried her roots deep in the earth so she could protect the valley. She listens to us when we're scared. She keeps the storms away." Jack swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't a man of faith, not anymore. But there was something about the way they spoke, the certainty in their voices, the way the forest seemed to hush around them, that made it hard to dismiss. He knelt down, trying not to frighten them. Up close he could see they were thin, their faces a little pale from the cold. "Where are your folks?" he asked gently. "You shouldn't be out here alone." The girl looked at him, then glanced toward the mountains beyond the clearing. "They're gone," she whispered. "The tribe moved south for the winter. But we couldn't leave her. We promised we'd stay until the thaw." Jack's throat tightened. Two little kids out here in the freezing woods clinging to a tree because they believed their mother's spirit lived inside it. It didn't make sense. It didn't feel right to leave them, but it didn't feel right to believe them either. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fade into the cold air. "You're brave, both of you," he said finally. "But this isn't safe. The weather's turning. You need to come with me. I'll take you to town. You can warm up, get some food." The boy stepped back, shaking his head violently. "No, if we leave, she'll be alone. She'll be scared." Jack sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Trees don't get scared, son." The boy looked up at him, eyes glinting like wet stone. "Then why is she crying?" Jack frowned. "Crying?" The girl pointed to the trunk. Jack turned and froze. Sap was oozing from the cut he'd made with his axe, thick and golden, running down the bark in long, slow tears. It caught the morning light, shimmering like honey. But as he stared, he realized it wasn't just sap. It was steaming faintly, like breath in cold air. He stumbled back a step. The forest around him seemed to shift, the quiet deepening into something almost alive. The wind moved through the branches in a low hum, almost like a voice. "Do you hear it?" the girl whispered. Jack stood very still, his heartbeat loud in his ears. He did hear something, soft, melodic, like a distant hum of song carried on the breeze. A woman's voice. He turned in a slow circle, eyes scanning the trees, but there was no one there. Only the sound, rising and falling, blending with the rustle of the leaves. The children stood together, holding hands, watching him with eyes that no longer seemed afraid. He took a deep breath. "What is this?" he muttered. "She's waking up," said the boy simply. Jack shook his head, trying to push away the feeling of unease. He'd worked in forests all his life, heard branches crack in the dark, seen shadows that moved like people. But this was different. This felt real. It felt aware. He looked at the children again. They were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, a kind of reverence. "Please," the girl said softly, "just go. Don't cut her. Leave her to rest." Jack looked down at his hands. They were shaking too. The axe felt heavier now, as if the forest itself were pressing against it. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Logic told him these were just kids with wild imaginations, maybe from a nearby village. But his gut, the part of him that still remembered the night his brother died under falling timber, told him this was something else. Something he wasn't meant to disturb. He looked at the tree one last time. The sap had slowed, but the mark of his axe glistened like an open wound. He whispered under his breath, "I'm sorry." The girl stepped forward, holding out her charm, the little bird carved from wood. "Keep this," she said, "so she knows you mean no harm." Jack hesitated, then took it gently. The charm was warm to the touch, even in the cold air. The twins turned and began walking into the mist hand in hand, their bare feet silent on the frost. "Wait," Jack called after them. "At least tell me where you live." But when the fog shifted, they were gone. Not a single footprint remained in the snow. He stood there for a long time, staring into the emptiness, his breath clouding in the still air. Then he looked down at the charm again. The small wooden bird seemed to glow faintly in his palm, its carved eyes glinting as though alive. And in that quiet, he swore he could hear a whisper, soft like the rustle of leaves, a voice older than the trees themselves. "Thank you." Jack turned sharply, but the clearing was empty. Only the ancient pine stood before him, tall and unmoving, its branches heavy with morning frost. He didn't swing his axe again that day. Instead, he gathered his things and walked back toward camp, the bird charm clutched tightly in his hand, and the forest humming behind him like it was alive. He didn't know yet, but that single act, hesitation, mercy, whatever you called it, was the beginning of something that would change him forever. The sun had barely climbed above the treetops when Jack returned to the clearing the next morning. He hadn't slept much. All night he'd tossed and turned, haunted by the memory of those children. Kaya and Toma, they said their names were. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces, heard the boy's trembling voice, and saw that strange golden sap oozing down the bark like the tree was bleeding light. He'd tried to convince himself it was just fatigue playing tricks on him. He'd been working long hours, too long maybe. He'd seen strange things in the woods before, a trick of mist, an echo of wind, but this was different. It had felt real, too real. Still, the company didn't pay him to believe in stories. He was hired to cut. That's what he told himself as he trudged through the cold, the weight of his axe heavy across his back. But when he reached the clearing, something made him stop short. The pine he had cut into was standing just as he'd left it, but the wound, the deep mark from his axe, was gone. The bark had somehow sealed itself overnight, smooth again, as if it had never been touched. Jack's stomach tightened. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He ran his hand across the trunk. It was solid, rough, and cold. There was no sign of damage, no sap. No mark, nothing. He stepped back, uneasy. The woods around him were silent again, but not the same kind of silence as yesterday. This felt thicker, heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. "All right," he muttered under his breath, rubbing his forehead. "Maybe I'm losing it." But he wasn't alone. From behind him came a soft sound like the flutter of tiny feet on snow. He turned quickly, and there they were again, Kaya and Toma, standing side by side at the edge of the clearing. He froze. "You again." The twins didn't move. The boy was staring right at him, his expression serious and unblinking. The girl held her charm close to her chest as if she feared it might be taken from her. "I told you," Toma said quietly. "You shouldn't come back." Jack sighed and rested his axe against the tree trunk. "Look, I'm not here to hurt anything, all right? But I can't just walk away. I got people breathing down my neck to finish this job." Kaya tilted her head slightly. "The men who cut trees?" "Yeah," Jack said, rubbing the back of his neck. "The company that pays me," Toma frowned. "They pay you to kill." Jack's chest tightened. "It's not like that. I don't enjoy it, kid. But people need wood for homes, for work. It's what keeps me alive, too." The boy stepped closer, his small footprints pressing into the snow. "You think that's living? Cutting down what keeps the world breathing?" Jack looked at him, startled by the weight of his words. There was something strange about the way the boy spoke. He didn't sound like a child. His voice carried something older, something ancient, as though the forest itself was speaking through him. He crouched down, resting one knee on the cold ground so he could look at them at eye level. "All right, tell me," he said softly. "Why is this tree so special? You said your mother's spirit lives here. What does that mean?" Kaya looked at her brother, then back at Jack. Her eyes were deep, dark, endless. "She was the healer of our tribe," she began slowly. "When she died, the elders said her soul must stay in the earth to guard the forest from harm. The great pine was chosen as her resting place. Its roots hold her spirit. When storms come, she calms them. When the rivers rise, she whispers to them to rest." Jack swallowed hard. "That's a beautiful story." "It's not just a story," Toma said sharply. "It's truth. She's alive here." He placed a hand on the trunk, fingers splayed wide. "If you listen close, you can hear her heartbeat." Jack hesitated, then, almost against his will, leaned forward and pressed his ear against the bark. At first, there was nothing. Just the sound of his own breath, but then something faint, something deep. A low rhythmic pulse like the steady thump of a drum hidden somewhere far below the earth. His eyes widened. He stepped back quickly, heart pounding. "What in God's name?" he whispered. Kaya looked at him calmly. "She knows you now." Jack blinked. "Knows me?" "She felt your axe," Toma said. "She felt your guilt. That's why she didn't let the wound stay." Jack ran a hand over his beard, feeling the world tilt slightly. This couldn't be happening. Trees didn't heal themselves. Spirits didn't speak. And yet, something in him knew it was real. He'd spent too many years working in these woods not to feel when something was wrong or sacred. He turned away, walking a few steps toward the clearing's edge, trying to clear his head. The frost crunched beneath his boots. The air smelled of pine and earth. After a long silence, he said quietly, "You kids got family somewhere." Kaya looked down at her feet. "The tribe went south before the snow came." "You mean they left you behind?" Jack asked. "They didn't want to," she said softly, "but we begged to stay. We promised Mother we wouldn't leave her alone. The elders said the forest would protect us." Jack's heart sank. "Protect you? Out here in the cold?" He looked around. Their clothes were thin, their skin pale. "You can't stay here. You'll freeze to death." Toma lifted his chin defiantly. "We're not afraid of the cold." "You should be," Jack said, his tone hardening. "Winter doesn't care how brave you are. Kaya stepped forward, her eyes glistening. And men don't care how sacred the forest is. Which one's worse? Jack stared at her, speechless. He didn't have an answer. He'd been in these woods long enough to know the truth in her words. Every year the company moved farther north, cutting deeper into untouched land. Every year the forest grew quieter. The streams ran thinner, the birds fewer. And every year he swung his axe like a soldier following orders, pretending he didn't notice what was disappearing. He looked back at the tree, the great pine, tall and still, and for the first time he saw it not as wood, not as work, but as something alive. He took a long breath. If what you're saying is true, he said slowly, then what do you want me to do? I can't stop the company. I'm just one man, Toma met his gaze. One man can stop an axe from falling. Jack frowned. That won't be enough. It will be, Kaya said quietly. If you believe what your heart already knows. Her words hung in the air like mist. Jack looked down at his hands. Calloused, rough-scarred from years of labor. Hands that had cut down thousands of trees. Hands that had built but also destroyed. He thought of his brother again. How they used to work side by side, laughing, racing to see who could fell the first trunk. Until that storm. Until the wind turned and the tree fell the wrong way. Until the scream. He swallowed the lump in his throat. You don't understand, he murmured. I've been doing this too long. I can't just walk away, Kaya's voice softened. You can always walk away from what's wrong. He turned to her, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something in her eyes. A shimmer, faint and golden, like sunlight filtering through leaves. He took a slow step back. What are you two, really? He asked. The twins exchanged a glance, then looked at him together. We're what she left behind, Toma said. Jack frowned. You mean her children? Kaya hesitated. Something like that. There was a long silence. The wind whispered through the branches, and the world seemed to fade around them. Jack sighed deeply and sat down on a fallen log, setting his axe beside him. He stared at the tree for a long time. You know, he said after a while, when I was your age, my father used to bring me to the woods. He said the forest has a soul, that if you listen close, you can hear it breathing. I didn't believe him. I used to laugh. He gave a small, bitter smile. Guess I'm not laughing now. Kaya smiled faintly. Your father was right. The forest breathes, and it remembers. Jack looked up. Remembers? Toma nodded. Every footstep, every cut, every word. It remembers kindness. And pain. That made Jack's chest tighten. He thought of all the trees he'd felled without a second thought. All the sounds of splitting wood that had echoed through the valleys. He stood slowly. All right, he said. I'll talk to the foreman. See if I can get this patch spared. The twins exchanged a look. You do that? Kaya asked, her voice cautious. He nodded. Yeah, I can't promise anything, but I'll try. The boy studied him carefully. Then he said quietly, if you break your promise, she'll know. Jack managed a faint smile. I figured as much. He bent down, scooped a handful of snow, and let it melt in his palm. You two got a place to stay tonight? Kaya shook her head. We'll stay here, Jack frowned. That's not safe. We're not afraid, Toma repeated. He wanted to argue, but something in their calm stopped him. He sighed. All right. But if the weather turns bad, you find me, you hear? My cabin's just down the river. They both nodded silently. Jack picked up his axe, slung it over his shoulder, and started walking toward the path. But just before he disappeared into the mist, Kaya called out, Wait! He turned. She walked up to him and pressed her tiny hand into his. When she pulled away, there was a single pine needle lying in his palm, perfectly green and whole. Keep it, she said softly. So she remembers your promise. Jack looked at the pine needle for a long time. It was such a small thing, fragile and weightless, yet it felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 roots. He nodded once, tucked it carefully into his pocket, and turned away. As he walked, the forest whispered behind him softly at first, then rising into a low hum that made the hair on his arm stand up. He didn't look back, but in his chest something was changing. A seed, small and quiet, had been planted, one that would soon grow roots deeper than he could ever imagine. The night settled heavy and cold over the valley, wrapping the forest in a deep silence that felt older than time itself. The stars were distant sparks in a frozen sky, and the moon hung pale and watchful above the tall black pines. Jack McGraw sat alone in his cabin, a small wooden structure barely holding back the chill. The fire in the stove crackled weakly, throwing orange light across the walls, and his big shadow moved like a ghost on the logs. He couldn't stop thinking about them. The twins. Kaya and Toma. The way they'd appeared and vanished like mist. The way the tree had healed itself. The pulse he'd heard through the bark. He'd tried to convince himself all day that it had been a dream, or maybe just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But the little pine needle still sat in his pocket, fresh and green as the moment she'd given it to him. He'd pulled it out again and again, just to see if it had turned brittle or brown. It hadn't. He leaned forward now, holding it between his fingers, studying it by the firelight. The color was almost luminous, like it held its own quiet glow. He ran his thumb along the edge. It was smooth, alive, delicate. It shouldn't have lasted this long. Not in this cold, not out of the soil, but it looked as if it had just fallen from the branch. He set it down gently on the table and poured himself a cup of coffee. The bitterness burned down his throat, but the warmth helped chase away the cold creeping through the cabin. Outside, the forest moaned softly under the wind. He'd been planning to visit the foreman the next morning, to tell him that the big pine couldn't be cut. That something about that place wasn't right, but he already knew how that conversation would go. The foreman would laugh, tell him to stop drinking, remind him that the company owned every inch of those woods on paper. The job would continue, and if Jack didn't do it, someone else would. He rubbed a hand across his tired face and stared into the fire. The flames licked at the air, curling around blackened wood, shifting between red and gold. He watched them for a long time, the crackling filling the silence like faint whispers. And then from outside came another sound, faint, almost fragile, a song. Jack froze, his mug halfway to his lips. He listened. It was so soft that he thought at first it might just be the wind. But no, this was different. It had melody, notes rising and falling in a slow rhythm, weaving through the cold like a lullaby carried by the trees. A woman's voice, low, mournful, and beautiful. He stood slowly, the floor creaking under his boots. The sound was coming from the woods beyond the cabin. He grabbed his coat and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a wall, biting into his skin. The world outside was bathed in moonlight, silver and still. The forest stretched before him, shadows tangled between the trunks. The song drifted again, clearer now, like it was calling him. He couldn't understand the words, but the emotion in them was unmistakable. Sorrow, love, loneliness. Without thinking, he followed the sound. The snow crunched softly under his boots as he moved between the trees, guided only by that haunting melody. The deeper he went, the stronger it became. He passed through patches of fog that curled like smoke, and each breath he took came out in pale clouds that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. He didn't know how far he'd walked before the clearing came into view, the same clearing where he'd met the twins. The same tree, it looked different at night. The great pine towered above everything, its branches glowing faintly as if catching light from somewhere beneath the earth. The ground shimmered with frost, and the air around it felt alive, humming quietly, vibrating in his chest. And there, by the roots, he saw them. Kaya and Toma stood hand in hand, facing the tree. Their small forms were outlined in silver light, and when Jack stepped closer, he could see that they weren't entirely solid. Their outlines shimmered as if part of them belonged to the air. He stopped a few paces away, his breath caught in his throat. "You," he whispered. Kaya turned slowly, her dark eyes calm and sad. "You heard her," Jack nodded numbly. "The song?" She smiled faintly. "That's her voice. She sings when she remembers." Toma looked up from where he stood, his small face lit with moonlight. "You shouldn't have come back, giant man. Not unless you're ready to listen." Jack frowned. "Listen to what?" Kaya stepped forward, her bare feet leaving no prints in the snow. "The truth," she said softly. "About her? About you?" He stared at her, confused. "About me?" She nodded once and reached out her hand. He hesitated, then slowly took it. Her skin was cold but soft, and the moment their hands touched, the world seemed to tilt. The wind stopped. The forest faded. Suddenly, he wasn't standing in the clearing anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere alive. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of rain and wildflowers. The forest was green and full of light. Birds sang overhead, And in the middle of it all stood the same great pine, but smaller, younger, vibrant. Beneath it knelt a woman, her long dark hair braided down her back, her hands pressed to the soil. She was humming the same song he'd heard in the night. "That's her," Kaya whispered beside him. The woman's lips moved as she spoke softly to the earth, words in a language Jack didn't understand, but he didn't need to. He could feel it, the love, the reverence, the connection between her and the forest. The trees leaned toward her as if listening. Then the scene changed. The sky darkened, clouds swirling overhead. Wind tore through the valley. Lightning flashed across the mountains. A great storm was coming. The woman lifted her head, her expression grave. She spread her arms wide, speaking again to the wind, to something unseen. The forest trembled in response. She gave herself to protect the land. Kaya's voice whispered. When the floods came, she called the forest to hold the mountains together. But the storm took her body. Jack watched as the woman knelt once more beside the young pine, laying her hands against it. A soft light spread from her palms into the roots, flowing downward into the earth. Her form began to fade, merging with the tree until only the glow remained. And then the world went dark again. Jack stumbled back, gasping. He was standing in the clearing once more, his heart pounding. The twins were watching him quietly. What did you show me?" he whispered. "The truth," Thomas said. "She became the heart of this forest. Her spirit is its breath." Jack looked up at the pine, the glow still faintly pulsing at its roots. "And you too?" Kaya's eyes softened. "We are her voice. When people forget to listen, we remind them." Jack felt his knees weaken. He sank to the ground, staring at the earth beneath him. "So you're not real?" Toma tilted his head. "We are as real as you need us to be." Jack let out a shaky laugh. "You sound like something out of a fairy tale." "Maybe you're in one," Kaya said gently. "Maybe you always were." He sat there in silence, the cold forgotten, the night alive around him. After a long time, he spoke again, his voice quiet. "When I first came here, I thought the forest was just work. Just trees to be cut, land to be cleared. But now," he looked at the pine, awe filling his eyes. "Now I feel like I've been blind my whole life." Kaya smiled sadly. "Most men are. Until the forest decides to open their eyes." Jack nodded slowly. He looked down at his hands, these hands that had built and broken in equal measure. "What do you want me to do?" Toma stepped forward, his eyes bright with something fierce and old. "Promise you won't let them hurt her," Jack swallowed. "If I say no, then she'll weep," the boy said simply. "And the forest will remember." He looked up again at the tree. The wind moved gently through its branches, and he thought, just for a moment, that he saw the faint outline of a woman's face in the shifting shadows of the leaves. He rose slowly to his feet and placed his large, rough hand against the bark. The surface was warm now, pulsing faintly beneath his palm. He closed his eyes. "No one's ever going to touch you again," he whispered. The forest seemed to sigh in relief. When he opened his eyes, the twins were smiling faintly. Kaya's form shimmered softly in the moonlight. "She hears you," she said. "She forgives you." Jack blinked, his throat tight. "Forgives me? For what?" "For forgetting what you were," Thomas said. "You were never a destroyer, Jack McGraw. You were a protector once. You just forgot how to listen." Something inside him cracked open then, an old guilt, an old pain, the memory of his brother, the weight of every fallen tree, every regret he'd carried. He felt it all wash through him like a river breaking a dam. He dropped his axe onto the frozen ground. The sound echoed once, then was gone. "I'm done cutting," he said softly. The twins nodded. "Then your heart will rest." A sudden breeze swept through the clearing, carrying snowflakes that sparkled like tiny stars. The twins stepped back, their figures growing fainter. "Wait," Jack said, stepping forward. "Will I see you again?" Kaya's voice was barely a whisper now. "You'll hear us in the wind. You'll see us in the trees. That's enough." And then they were gone, dissolving into the mist like morning fog. Jack stood alone before the great pine, the night silent around him. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive, warm, breathing, infinite. He turned slowly and began walking back toward his cabin, leaving his axe behind, half buried in the snow. As he walked, the wind rose again, soft and melodic, the same song as before, but this time it wasn't mournful. It was peaceful. And though he didn't look back, he knew the forest was watching him go. When he reached his cabin, the first light of dawn was touching the horizon. He sat by the fire once more, pulled the pine needle from his pocket, and set it gently on the table beside him. It glowed faintly, just like before. Jack smiled, small, tired, but real. Outside, the great pine stood tall in the distance, its branches whispering softly in the morning wind. The forest had found its protector again. The sun was slow to rise that morning, as if it too was hesitant to see what had become of the valley. Mist hung thick across the forest floor, curling around the roots of the giant pine like pale fingers. The air was cold enough to bite, but it carried a strange calmness on that one that felt both sacred and unsettling. The foreman, Henry Dalton, stomped through the frost-covered brush with frustration etched into every heavy step. He had expected to find Jack McGraw hard at work before dawn. The company's orders were clear. Clear the northern ridge, every last tree. Time was money, and Jack had always been his most reliable man. But what Henry saw when he entered the clearing stopped him in his tracks. There, at the base of the oldest pine in the valley, Jack's work site stood empty. No sign of the giant lumberjack. His tent flap hung open, his tools lay scattered, and the ground was untouched. Not a single tree felled. But the strangest thing of all was the tree itself. It seemed different. The bark shimmered faintly in the sunlight that broke through the fog, and its roots had twisted outward, gripping the earth like protective arms. At the very center of those roots was Jack's axe embedded deep in the soil, or rather in something that looked like stone. Henry blinked in disbelief. The axe that could cut through the thickest oak had turned completely to stone, its handle rough and gray like granite. He crouched down, running his hand over it, and felt a cold pulse travel up his fingers. "Jack?" he called out, his voice echoing off the trees. Nothing. Only the soft hum of the morning wind. He turned toward the woods. "Jack, you better not be screwing around again." The silence that answered him wasn't ordinary. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was something alive, something watching. The hairs on his neck rose. Henry stood up quickly, his boots crunching on the frost. The forest felt too still, too aware. Somewhere in the distance he thought he heard faint laughter, the sound of children playing. But when he spun around, there was no one. Meanwhile, miles away from the nearest town, a few villagers spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen the night before. An eerie glow had filled the northern sky, green and gold lights swirling above the ridge where the loggers worked. Old Mrs. Takala, one of the elders of the nearby native settlement, clutched her shawl tighter as she watched the horizon. "The spirits have awakened," she murmured, "and the giant has chosen his path." Back at the clearing, Henry tried to make sense of it all. Jack was no fool, but he had been distant lately, quiet in a way that unsettled even the toughest men at camp. He had spoken less, stared more at the tree line as if listening to whispers no one else could hear. Maybe he'd snapped and gone wandering into the wilderness. The thought of losing his best man and an entire day's work made Henry grit his teeth. He decided to wait. The other workers arrived soon after, carrying their saws and ropes, joking and grumbling as usual, until they saw what Henry had seen. Then one by one their laughter died. "What the hell?" one of them muttered, pointing to the axe. "That ain't possible." Another took a step closer, but Henry barked, "Don't touch it." His voice was sharper than he intended, but there was something in the air that made everyone uneasy. The youngest of them, a boy named Eli, frowned as he stared at the old pine. "Looks like it's breathing," he said softly. They laughed nervously, but then they saw it. The faint movement of the bark, like the tree itself, exhaled mist into the air. A low hum began to fill the clearing, almost like a song. Not loud, not threatening, but sad, ancient. Henry swallowed hard and tore his eyes away. "Pack it up," he said. "We'll start on the south ridge instead." But even as he said it, he knew deep down no one would return here. That night, in the dim glow of the logging camp, talk of Jack McGraw spread like wildfire. Some said he'd gone mad. Others whispered that the spirits had taken him. Old Tom, who'd worked the forests longer than anyone, shook his head. "Men don't just vanish," he said. "Not without reason. That forest don't forget and it don't forgive." As days turned into weeks, strange things began to happen in the northern valley. The loggers who ventured too close reported hearing laughter, the light giggling of children playing somewhere among the trees. Footprints would appear overnight in the frost, small bare feet leading toward the giant pine and then disappearing altogether. And sometimes, when the fog was thick, a figure could be seen moving between the trunks. A tall man, broad as a bear, walking slowly with an axe-shaped shadow slung over his shoulder. But when anyone tried to approach, he would vanish into the mist, leaving only the echo of a single deep laugh that sent chills through even the bravest hearts. The logging company finally abandoned the northern ridge altogether. No one wanted to work there. They called it the Whispering Woods. Henry, however, couldn't let it go. He returned months later, driven by guilt and curiosity. He had to know what happened to Jack. The forest was different now, greener, denser, alive in a way that made him uneasy. He followed the old trail until he reached the clearing. The tent was gone. The tools were rusted. The axe was still there, encased in roots and stone. But now the pine had grown even taller, its branches reaching high into the heavens. Henry took off his hat and stepped closer. He knelt before the roots, whispering softly, "You really did it, didn't you, old friend?" He touched the stone axe again, and for a fleeting second he swore he heard Jack's deep voice in the rustling leaves. "Told you I'd find peace, Henry." Tears stung the foreman's eyes. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the tree that now seemed more monument than living thing. Then as he turned to leave, he noticed something new carved into the bark. Two small handprints side by side, childish,